on various safety subjects. These can be viewed and downloaded from the ASA site, www.asa.net. Also available on the ASA site are recordings and downloads of previous webinars. All of these items are available free to the public. Look for the Safety Resources link on the ASA homepage, which is located at www.asa.net. If you have any problems, please contact Dan Hilton at ASA for assistance. I'd like to draw your attention today to ASA's supplier partners shown on the opening screen. We want to thank them for their industrial leadership and in supporting the Safety Committee and these webinars. This webinar is being recorded for later viewing. Everyone that registered for the webinar will receive an email notifying them when and where the replay for the webinar is available with a link to its location. All attendees are in mute mode. To submit a question during the presentation, you can enter it in the chat window. Before you send it, be sure the settings are sent to organizers and panelists so that we can see the question. All questions will be answered at the end of the presentation as time allows. Also, an FAQ document with all questions and answers and other related documents will be posted on the ASA site along with the replay of today's webinar. The presentation today is your business ready for the Hazard Communication Standard? The presenter today is Louisa Mayers, Director of Regulatory Services Group of SDSpro, formerly known as MSDSpro. The Regulatory Services Group includes SDS authoring. Since 1995, SDSpro has provided industry-leading MSDS and chemical inventory management solutions to ensure employee safety with hazardous chemicals. Full bio of the presenter will be posted with webinar documents on the ASA site at www.asa.net. I now turn the presentation over to Louisa.
Thank you, Ricky, and good day, everyone. As Ricky mentioned, my name is Louisa Mayers, and I'm the Director of Regulatory Services at SDSpro. On behalf of SDSpro, I'd like to thank the American Supply Association and the ASA Safety Committee for the opportunity to present today's webinar, and I thank you in the audience for sharing part of your business day with us. The May 2012 implementation of the revised OSHA HCS standard has brought to the forefront a renewed focus on chemical compliance in the workplace, additional training requirements for hazardous chemicals used in the workplace in particular. The objective of today's session is to summarize how and where OSHA's final rule impacts the supply chain, specifically on the manufacturer and employer's responsibility to provide regulated documents under the requirements of the revised HCS standard, through revised labels and safety data sheets which conform to HCS 2012. Today's presentation will provide some background information on the United Nations GHS and the current implementation status of GHS in the Americas, including Canada. This presentation also will take you through a high-level overview of the U.S. OSHA HCS 2012 standard. We'll review the changes to the Material Safety Data Sheet, now known as the SDS, or Safety Data Sheet, focusing on the GHS data elements. These elements are the GHS signal word, pictograms, hazard statements, and precautionary statements. Finally, we'll also review the phase-in dates for compliance with OSHA's final rule and take a look at the resources that are available to both manufacturers and employers to help them meet their chemical compliance obligations, including a checklist to begin that process in the workplace. Let's get started. Under the United States OSHA Hazard Communication Standard, barrier-free employee access to safety data sheets is required by law. Depending on the quantity of supplier and third-party SDSs your company manages in-house, replacing a hard copy MSDS binder with an electronic document management system that provides multiple options to search, view, and print supplier safety data sheets may be a consideration to help you meet OSHA's right to know and right to understand requirements. Whether your company uses hard copy MSDS binders or an electronic SDS management system to distribute supplier SDSs, your path to OSHA HAZCOM 2012 compliance is the same. The basic steps are to audit, update, and distribute. First, perform an audit. Conduct a physical chemical inventory of your facility. Then, update your safety data sheets. Contact the manufacturers for updated SDSs on the products listed on your inventory lists. And finally, distribute your safety data sheets. Ensure your SDSs are easily accessible to your workplace employees and chemical users. Now let's turn our focus to GHS and its impact on the U.S. manufacturer and employer. In 1983, OSHA enacted the Hazard Communication Standard to ensure that the hazards of all chemicals produced or imported are classified, and that the information on the classified hazards are communicated to employers and their employees through a comprehensive hazard communication program, container labeling, material safety data sheets, and employee training. So why the change from the current HAZCOM standard? OSHA modified the HAZCOM standard to improve the overall safety and health of workers through more effective and standardized communications on hazardous chemicals in the workplace. Within the GHS classification system, there are three major hazard groups: physical hazards, health hazards, and environmental hazards. Within each of these hazard groups, there are classes and categories. Each of these parts is called a building block. Each country can determine which building blocks of the GHS system it will use in its different sectors. Consumers, workers, transport workers, and emergency responders are all impacted by the implementation of GHS, whether you reside in the United States, Japan, China, Hong Kong, or any one of the 28 member states in the European Union. Once the building blocks are chosen, the corresponding GHS rules for classification and labels must be used. In June 2011, Mexico voluntarily adopted portions of the United Nations GHS and Spanish language requirement. Now Mexico, as well as other Spanish-speaking countries in Latin America and South America, are covered by the United Nations GHS safety data sheet. The exception to this is Brazil, which adopted its own version of GHS with a Portuguese language requirement. For the European Union, the EU CLP GHS safety data sheet is jurisdiction and language specific. The URL at the bottom of this slide will take you to the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe's page on the GHS implementation status, compiled and summarized for different countries. A question posed by one of our session attendees earlier was, can multiple countries be implemented onto one North America GHS safety data sheet? The short answer is yes. On February 11th of this year, the Hazardous Products Regulation, known as the HPR, was issued in the Canada Gazette Part 2. At that time, Canada issued its long-anticipated announcement of WHMIS 2015, Canada's adoption of the United Nations GHS. In many ways, WHMIS 2015 is closely aligned with the United States OSHA Hazard Communication Standard. Now, manufacturers who ship their products throughout North America may issue a single North America GHS safety data sheet. Almost 3 years ago, on May 25, 2012, the United States aligned with the United Nations GHS through the implementation of the revised OSHA HAZCOM standard. As a result, chemical manufacturers and importers must now classify their products under Revision 3 of the United Nations GHS and provide labels that include the applicable signal word, GHS pictograms, and hazard and precautionary statements for each hazard class and category. The revised manufacturer safety data sheet now specifies a 16-section safety data sheet heading, the order of information, and the information to be provided under those headings. OSHA's revisions to the HAZCOM standard are expected to improve the use of work practices and appropriate exposure controls to lessen the health and safety risks associated with hazardous chemical exposure. Over 5 million workplaces in the United States, representing 43 million employees, are expected to benefit from the safe use and appropriate handling of chemicals, thereby improving overall worker health and safety. From the employer standpoint, the biggest concerns with implementing OSHA HAZCOM 2012 include the understanding of the new and different requirements, employee training requirements, and the manufacturer's responsibility to send out an OSHA HAZCOM 2012 compliant SDS, among other concerns. The primary concerns posted by manufacturers and formulators include the final hazard classification of their products under OSHA HAZCOM 2012. Given OSHA's deadline of June 1st, 2015, to convert its current product material safety data sheets to the OSHA HAZCOM 2012 SDS format, and that we are less than 8 weeks, that's right, 8 weeks, away from the June 1st deadline, it is imperative that manufacturers put a strategic plan in place to ensure their finished product safety data sheets are reauthored so that they meet the current chemical regulations wherever their company's products are shipped, including within the United States. The United States Department of Labor has provided this website as a primary resource to employers and manufacturers on how to comply with OSHA HAZCOM 2012. Bookmark this site and visit it often to view additional resources to assist with OSHA HAZCOM 2012 compliance. This table shows the phase-in dates for the listed responsible parties to comply with OSHA's final rule. The first effective completion date was December 1st, 2013, where U.S.-based employers must train their employees and chemical users on the new GHS label elements and SDS format. This requirement is in conjunction with others put in place prior to the final rule, where under the HAZCOM standard, chemical manufacturers and importers must classify their finished products and label them accordingly. Employers, they are responsible for preparing a written HAZCOM program to include a list of hazardous chemicals and ensure proper labeling of those hazardous chemicals and provide worker training. For employers, the updated HAZCOM standard has resulted in a renewed emphasis focusing on worker training and the right to understand. Employees should be trained whenever they're assigned to work with a chemical, over and above being handed a safety data sheet. GHS provides guidance on classifying pure chemicals and mixtures according to its criteria or rules, and the communication of the hazards and precautionary information using safety data sheets and labels. Under GHS in general, all hazards need to be classified according to the specific GHS criteria of the country of distribution, whether under United States OSHA HAZCOM 2012, the European Union CLP, or any other jurisdiction which has adopted GHS, and not simply evaluated based on the professional judgment call made by a manufacturer. Hazard statements are derived from the final hazard classification of the product. Precautionary statements are derived from the hazard statements. A significant change is to the MSDS format itself, which now mandates 16 section headings, the order of information, and the information to be provided under those headings to comply with the updated HAZCOM standard. With the new SDS format based on the ANSI Z401 2004 standard, Section 2 of the safety data sheet has undergone significant changes. Under OSHA HAZCOM 2012, the manufacturer SDS must now include all applicable hazard classes, categories, and GHS label elements of the final product, whether that product is a pure chemical or a mixture. The applicable category must always be shown next to the applicable hazard. Workplace employees and chemical users may view the product's hazard and precautionary statements in Section 2 of the safety data sheet. Let's take a closer look at the SDS section headings. As mentioned in an earlier slide, the revised SDS format under OSHA HCS 2012 specifies the 16 section SDS headings as you see here. While OSHA does not enforce sections 12 to 15 that require information outside OSHA's jurisdiction, these sections are required to appear on the safety data sheet to be consistent with the United Nations GHS. The maximum deadline for manufacturers to comply with OSHA HCS 2012 is June 1, 2015. Again, less than 8 weeks from today. The sections not under OSHA's jurisdiction are Section 12, Ecological Information, overseen by the EPA, Section 13, Disposal Considerations, under the EPA and RCRA for waste, Section 14, Transport Information, overseen by the U.S. Department of Transportation, and Section 15, Regulatory Information, including U.S. federal regulations, the Clean Air Act, state right-to-know lists, including California Prop 65 and New Jersey Right-to-Know. Here are the 9 United Nations GHS pictograms. These pictograms convey the health, physical, and environmental hazards of a product. HASCOM 2012 requires 8 of these pictograms, the exception being the environmental pictogram, as environmental hazards are not within OSHA's jurisdiction, but rather that of the EPA. Physical or health hazard statements describe the nature and degree of a hazard. Each hazard class may be subdivided in the criteria into several hazard categories based on the degree of severity of the hazard. For the manufacturers and formulators attending today's presentation, address your complex mixtures now to ensure the substances are classified properly. Physical hazards are classified based on the physical data of the final product mixture, for example, the flash point. Health hazards are determined by a complex calculation based on ingredient classification versus a cutoff percentage. All health hazards are covered, but the following hazard categories are not covered under HASCOM 2012. Acute toxicity, Category 5, corrosion irritation, Category 3, aspiration hazard, Category 2, and environmental hazards, all categories. Note that manufacturers may add the environmental hazards, but OSHA does not require them to do so. Chemical manufacturers and importers must evaluate the hazards of the chemicals they produce or import and provide information about them in the form of labels and safety data sheets. Employers whose employees are exposed to these hazardous chemicals must prepare and implement a written HASCOM program to ensure all hazardous chemical containers are labeled, ensure worker access to safety data sheets, and conduct an effective training program for all potentially exposed workers. Note that the term workers is not limited to just a company's employees. Rather, the term applies to any chemical user in the workplace. Given the country-specific changes to chemical regulations, the new GHS label elements, and the SDS format, how does the manufacturer determine whether to author its product safety data sheets in-house or consider outsourcing to an authoring services provider? Some of our webinar attendees today aren't chemical manufacturers or blenders. Rather, they have R&D environments where their chemists, researchers, and R&D personnel create formulations for in-house use. Perhaps there are byproducts or intermediates created during the manufacturing process. Guess what? You need a safety data sheet for that. Other folks attending our webinar today are finished goods and articles manufacturers who ship their products throughout the global marketplace. You guessed it again. For article shipments to the European Union in particular, manufacturers need to provide documentation to confirm the nature and safety of their finished good in the workplace. These bullet points summarize the steps the chemical manufacturer, blender, and importer need to follow to comply with OSHA's final rule. They need to conduct a chemical inventory. They need to classify the individual substances under GHS and provide the GHS classification to the supply chain. To properly classify a potentially hazardous product under OSHA HCS 2012, the manufacturer would need to obtain a copy of the GHS criteria. They would also need to identify the relevant hazard data for their ingredients and products, review the data in light of the classification criteria to determine the appropriate hazard classes and categories. Note that there is specific guidance for classifying the health and environmental hazards of mixtures. Then finally, document the rationale and information for future reference. A GHS Substance Library may also be built through an analysis report that provides the proper GHS classification for a substance, pure chemical, or a chemical mixture for any country or jurisdiction where the manufacturer's products are shipped. Using an example for the United States, here is a sample GHS data analysis report. This report is based on the product's physical and chemical information, as shown in Section 2, and the complete product formulation, as shown in Section 3, cast number and weight percentage for each substance. From this data, the following information is made available on the report. Confirmation of flammability, including the flash point and flammable limits, reactivity, including the chemical stability in hazardous decomposition products, and toxicological properties, among them acute and chronic toxicity and target organs. The GHS Data Analysis Report also provides data on ecotoxicity, environmental effects, persistence and degradability, and bioaccumulation potential, terms that are new under OSHA HCS 2012. The report also provides data on transport information, the UN number, proper shipping name, class and packing group, and the product classification under OSHA HCS 2012. As a result of this report and the stated GHS hazard classification in particular, a manufacturer's R&D or research team may now move forward with authoring a formal GHS safety data sheet with a given formulation, or elect to modify the formulation in order to lower certain hazards while ensuring the efficacy of the product. Let's turn our attention now to the new SDS under OSHA HCS 2012. Before we move forward, a brief disclaimer. This section of the presentation is intended as a general overview of specific sections within the revised safety data sheet and is not meant to serve as a formal HCS 2012 training document. For additional information, please post questions and we'll address different resources that would be available to you for additional training through the FAQ. Under Section 1, Section 1 identifies the chemical and its intended use. It also provides supplier information and required information under the revised standard. The header at the top of the SDS, which states conforms to HCS 2012 United States, confirms for the reader that the SDS conforms to OSHA's new final rule. The required information under the revised standard in Section 1 includes the product identifier. This identifier is also used on the label and on any other essential contact information of the supplier. The common names or synonyms by which the substance is known, contact information on the manufacturer, including name, address, and phone number, the importer, or any other responsible party, and the emergency phone number. And finally, the recommended use of the chemical and any restrictions on use. It would include a brief description of what the chemical does and recommendations given by the supplier. Section 2 is where the significant changes to the SDS takes place. In Section 2, all applicable hazard classes and categories and label elements of the manufacturer's final product are shown here. The classification and GHS label elements displayed on the HazCom 2012 label must match the product safety data sheet. The hazard pictograms, which may be represented as a graphical reproduction of the symbols in black and white, or be a description of the name of the symbol, like skull and crossbones or flame. As for the signal word, only two terms are possible under HazCom 2012, danger or warning. The term caution may no longer be used. Also reflected in Section 2 are the hazard statements, which reflect the health and physical hazards of the product. Precautionary statements include those for prevention, response, storage, and disposal. With all that being said, there are some hazards that aren't specifically covered under the GHS label elements. Hazards like pyrophoric gases, simple asphyxiants, and combustible dust have their own unique requirements. As such, they've been labeled as hazards not otherwise classified and are also stated in Section 2. Hazards listed here must include information on chemicals with adverse physical or health effects that are identified during the evaluation of scientific evidence, even if the chemicals do not fall under any of the existing hazard classes. Section 3 provides the composition information on ingredients. It lists those ingredients in the product which contribute to the hazard listed in Section 2, including impurities and stabilizing additives. This section includes information on substances, mixtures, and all chemicals where a trade secret is claimed. For substances, the chemical name, common name, and synonyms are listed, as is the CAS number and other unique identifiers. For chemical mixtures, it's the same type of information that is required for substances, the chemical name and concentration of all ingredients which are classified as health hazards and are present above their cutoff or concentration limits, or present a health risk below the cutoff or concentration limit. The concentration, exact percentages, of each ingredient would be specified, except concentrations may be used under the following situations. If there is a batch-to-batch variation of the ingredient in the product, if the manufacturer safety data sheet applies to a group of substantially similar mixtures. In this case, these mixtures contain the same exact ingredients at levels at which the same final hazard classification applies. Or a claim for trade secret is made, meaning the specific chemical identity and or exact percentage of composition has been withheld as a trade secret. Section 14 provides transport information. It provides guidance on the classification of information for shipping and transporting hazardous chemicals by road, air, rail, or sea. The information includes the United Nations number, a 4-figure ID number of the substance, the UN proper shipping name, transport hazard class or classes, and the packing group number if applicable, based on the degree of the hazard. Section 14 also conveys environmental hazards, such as whether the product is a marine pollutant according to the IMDG, the International Maritime Dangerous Goods Code. Section 14 may also list any special precautions which an employee should be aware of or needs to comply with in connection with transport or conveyance, either within or outside their premises. Section 15 provides regulatory information. This section identifies the safety, health, and environmental regulations specific to the product not indicated anywhere else on the safety data sheet. The information may include any national and or regional regulatory information of the chemical or mixtures. In this example, for TSCA 8A and 8B, Clean Air Act Sections 112, 602, DEA Lists 1 and 2, and SARA 302, 304, 304 reportable quantities, and 311, 312, the SDS must indicate whether the chemical product is listed or the regulation is applicable. In this table, the ingredient responsible for the SARA 311, 312 fire and immediate acute health hazard is listed at its concentration percentage on the table shown. State regulations where the material is listed also would be displayed in Section 15, as are international regulations, including international lists and chemical weapons convention lists. As for Section 16, other useful information to the reader may be included here, including the HMIS and NFPA data, should the manufacturer include it on the safety data sheet. If an employer has an in-plant or workplace system of labeling that meets the requirement of the OSHA HCS 1994 standard, the employer may continue to use this system in the workplace as long as this labeling system, in conjunction with other information immediately available to employees, provides the employees with the information on all of the health and physical hazards of the hazardous material. Under OSHA HCS 2012, the HMIS rating and the NFPA rating are not required to appear on the SDS. However, employers may continue to use the rating systems such as the NFPA diamonds or HMIS requirements for its workplace labels, as long as the labels themselves are consistent with the requirements of the HCS and the employees through training are fully aware of the hazards used. Per OSHA, employers may choose to label workplace containers either with the same label that would be shipped on containers for the chemical under the revised rule, or with label alternatives that meet the requirements for the standard. During that transition period, employers have been known to use both as part of their ongoing training on the new GHS label elements in the workplace. Finally, Section 16 also states when the SDS was prepared or when the last known revision was made. It may also state which sections were amended from the previous version. For specific questions on Section 16, employers are encouraged to contact the supplier for a detailed explanation of the changes. The supplier may also provide other useful information in Section 16. To summarize, manufacturers will need to address the reclassification of their products and reauthor their SDS and labels and create new safety data sheets and labels for new products that comply with the updated OSHA HCS 2012 standard. Employers must review their current HCS program and update it as necessary. They must also ensure they have the most current supplier SDSs for each of the hazardous chemicals present in the workplace. From this U.S. Department of Labor site, manufacturers and employers alike may access several OSHA briefs, fact sheets, and quick cards. These guidance documents are helpful references to help employers develop their company-wide training plans on the GHS label elements and GHS SDS format. These documents include the HCS standard wallet card, the fact sheet on the final rule itself, and quick cards on safety data sheets, labels, and pictograms. Also included are OSHA HCS standard briefs on safety data sheets and labels and pictograms. Also available on the site is the OSHA fact sheet on training requirements for the revised HCS standard. Employers are encouraged to review and reference this document for its onboard training for new employees and refresher hazardous chemical safety training sessions, specifically to address the new safety data sheets and labels under OSHA HAZCOM 2012. As was in effect prior to the implementation of OSHA HAZCOM 2012, U.S. employers continue to be responsible for maintaining and distributing updated SDSs in the workplace and providing training on the safe use of hazardous chemicals. This checklist for compliance applies to all U.S. employers throughout the supply chain. Employers must ensure the most current supplier SDS for each chemical product used in the workplace is available to their employers and chemical users. Do not presume that chemicals previously considered non-hazardous by a manufacturer remain so under OSHA HAZCOM 2012. A new safety data sheet is required to confirm whether the product is hazardous or not under the new OSHA HAZCOM standard. Here are the steps that you can take today towards compliance. First, audit your hazardous chemicals. Conduct a physical chemical inventory of your facility by location, your shipping and receiving areas, flammable cabinets, supply closets, production floor, and maintenance areas, among others. As you inventory your chemicals, ensure all containers are properly labeled. Identify those chemicals that are eligible for disposal, and locate unauthorized chemicals throughout your facility. Then, acquire updated safety data sheets for your chemicals. Contact your manufacturers, suppliers, and distributors in your supply chain for updated SDSs for the hazardous products stored in your facility. Next, distribute your supplier SDSs. Ensure your chemical users have free, unlimited access to the updated safety data sheets via electronic means, hard copy SDS binders, or a combination of SDS distribution methods. And finally, the most important step is to train your employees and chemical users. Update your existing hazardous chemical training program to include the GHS data elements and format of the SDS, and schedule regular training sessions. One final, yet very important note on OSHA HAZCOM 2012. This memorandum, issued by OSHA on February 9th of this year, describes OSHA's enforcement position on HAZCOM 2012 after the June 1st deadline. It is available at the website listed on your screen. This OSHA memo specifically addresses those manufacturers and importers, including product formulators, who have exercised reasonable diligence and good faith to classify their chemical mixtures according to HAZCOM 2012 and have developed HAZCOM 2012 compliant safety data sheets and labels. However, due to circumstances beyond their control, they may not have received classifications and SDS information from some upstream suppliers of raw chemicals in order for them to develop compliant safety data sheets for some of their products. This memo also describes the enforcement guidance and how it affects distributors as well. Employers and manufacturers with questions on this memorandum are encouraged to contact their local OSHA representatives directly. At this time, we'd like to open up the floor for questions.
Okay, let's see. Our first question. Our warehouse works with chemicals in sealed containers under normal conditions of use. What information do I have to provide for my workers who under normal circumstances would never be exposed to these chemicals?
That's a really good question. All employers, in addition to those in manufacturing and involved in importing, are responsible for informing and training their workers about the hazards in their workplaces. It includes retaining warning labels and making available safety data sheets for those hazardous chemicals. Some companies, they deal with chemicals in sealed containers, such as the retail trades, for example. Warehousing, truck and marine cargo handling come to mind as well. These employers must assure that labels affixed to those incoming containers of hazardous chemicals are kept in place. They should also maintain and provide access to safety data sheets they receive for these products, or perhaps obtain the SDSs if requested by the employee. And finally, like I mentioned earlier, they must train their workers on what to do in the event of a spill or leak of a hazardous chemical from a sealed container. Sealed containers, they do break, they do drop, and it's good to be prepared in advance of an event like that happening. Good question. Thank you.
Question number 2. Who is responsible for providing SDSs to distributors and employers?
Another good question. According to the OSHA HCS standard, whether it's the new revised standard of 2012 or the previous one that was in place, the chemical manufacturer or importer is responsible for providing these safety data sheets to a distributor or to an employer along with the shipped containers. Alternatively, the manufacturer or importer can send the SDS to the distributor or to the employer prior to or at the time of the product shipment itself. Now, in the case of when an SDS is not provided with the shipment of the hazardous chemical, the distributor or the employer should obtain one from the chemical manufacturer or that importer as soon as possible. By the same token, the SDS must be provided to the distributor or employer upon the request of that distributor or employer. Now, once they have those safety data sheets, basically in turn, they should ensure that the safety data sheets and any updated information are provided to other distributors and employers with the initial shipment and with the first shipment after an SDS is updated. Those distributors should either provide the SDS with the shipped containers or send them to the other distributors or to the employer prior to or at the time of shipping those hazardous chemicals. As far as wholesale distributors are concerned, they should also provide SDSs to employers or the other distributors upon request.
Okay, and our next question. If a mixture has a final pH that is neutral, thus not hazardous, would you have to list the individual ingredients if those themselves are hazardous? In other words, the ingredients would not have a neutral pH, but when they're blended together to make the final product, they do have a neutral pH.
Another good question. The pH is one of the factors that is taken into consideration in doing a data analysis to generate a safety data sheet for a chemical product. The criteria as to whether an ingredient would be disclosed in Section 3 under composition information, for example, is based on whether that particular ingredient has contributed to the overall final hazard classification in Section 2 of the safety data sheet. If it's found that there are no individual products that have contributed to the hazard, or if the product in and of itself is non-hazardous in Section 2, then no ingredients would be disclosed. In creating a safety data sheet, the data analysis includes taking each individual substance or ingredient in the formula and identifying the hazard classification of that ingredient within OSHA HCS 2012 guidelines. If you had 5 ingredients, each of these ingredients would be calculated as to their individual classification hazard. Taking the individual classification along with the physical and chemical characteristics of the product will result in the final hazard classification. Based on all of that information, the disclosure of ingredients would appear in Section 3 and in Section 15 as applicable.
Okay, next question. If a supplier of a chemical does not have an EPA ID number, are they required to furnish an SDS sheet for their product?
That's a good question. I would say that it would be a good idea to contact the local OSHA representative to see how that would play out. Environmental protection is one of the areas that's addressed within the safety data sheet, but asking the OSHA representative for guidance in that area would be prudent, especially since we're coming up to the deadline.
And I would say that having an EPA ID number has really nothing to do with having to provide an SDS sheet. The SDS sheet would have to be provided if you are a supplier of a chemical to a downstream. Okay? All right, and then the next question. If Section 2 on the SDS for labeling is blank for your product, in other words, it is not classified as hazardous, do you need to provide any type of label at all for the purposes of meeting GHS requirements?
As a general rule, most manufacturers or formulators, when they have a product where it is not classified as hazardous under OSHA HAZCOM 2012, actually have a choice. They can create a label because downstream employers and distributors are anticipating a label that says this product is non-hazardous under OSHA HAZCOM 2012, or they may elect not to provide a label. We've seen it both ways. What we are seeing more of is just so that the anticipation of having a label and SDS come together, that the content of the label itself would state that the product is considered non-hazardous, just to ensure that you're covering all the bases and also to have a reference back to the safety data sheet itself.
Also, for clarification, I would say that GHS is part of HAZCOM 2012, but people need to keep in mind that under HAZCOM 2012, you're still required in the workplace to have your items labeled, and for your recontained material, they'll need to be labeled and identified. Even when non-hazardous, they need to be identified with what the material is in that secondary container. Secondary container information is still required.
Right, because regardless of whether the product is considered hazardous or not, if you are moving your product from its original container to a secondary container, a label must be applied regardless of whether that product is considered hazardous.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, the next question. Does the inclusion of HMIS and NFPA elements ever sunset out from the inclusion on an SDS sheet?
Another good question, and there has been a lot of discussion among the various agencies around the applicability of the NFPA rating and HMIS rating. While OSHA HAZCOM 2012 does not mandate listing the NFPA rating or HMIS rating on a safety data sheet, there are multiple agencies in the United States that continue to look to the NFPA rating and HMIS rating for a number of different reasons. As such, it is a given that the NFPA and HMIS rating may be retained on the safety data sheet, or when the safety data sheet is reauthored to meet the OSHA HAZCOM 2012 requirements, that data may transfer, again, provided that there's no formulation change that would result in a different rating.
Very good. Okay. My next question. Is it a requirement that the NFPA or the HMIS is included in Section 16? My company is receiving SDSs where that information is included in Section 2 with the pictograms. Is that an option, or is that being done incorrectly?
According to what OSHA has stated on the website and in its brief and a detailed explanation on the safety data sheet format and content, the information that is absolutely required in Section 2 of the safety data sheet are the GHS label elements. Again, that's the signal word, the pictograms, the health and physical hazard statements, and the 4 types of precautionary statements. Nowhere does it state under OSHA HAZCOM 2012 that the NFPA or HMIS rating would appear under Section 2. The expectation is that the GHS label elements appear in Section 2. The reason why it's placed in Section 14, Section 16, is that while NFPA and HMIS are considered rating systems, the severity in terms of rating from 1 to 4, with 4 being greatest, is in potential contradiction of the categorization of a hazard under OSHA HAZCOM 2012 or the United Nations GHS in general. That's why, as a general rule, the NFPA and HMIS rating is put under Section 16. Now, for those manufacturers out there who put NFPA and HMIS rating information in Section 2, it is important that the manufacturer makes very clear to their downstream customer that the rating system under NFPA and HMIS is completely different than the categorization of a GHS hazard category.
Okay. In Section 3, if a mixture range is stated as a trade secret, is a category required for each compound in the mixture? And the second caveat to that is, where can I locate the concentration and cutoff limits?
Answering the second question first, there are a variety of resources that an employer who's creating the safety data sheet in-house can turn to. The most important one would be OSHA HAZCOM 2012 and the guidelines that it applies under the final rule. The document is several hundred pages long, but it outlines specifically what the references are for that. There are opportunities to have a data analysis report rendered for that particular product to determine that information as well as the United Nations Purple Book, which is currently in revision, a higher revision than revision 3, which is what the United States OSHA is following today. In order to determine whether the compound itself would need to be placed in Section 3 would be based on whether it contributes to the final hazard classification of the product. And that again goes back to identifying through a series of calculations and algorithms as to what degree that hazard category would apply and in what area it would apply, whether it be acute toxicity or one of the other hazard categories.
Okay. With the old system of NFPA, we were required to keep a log of any chemical with an NFPA of 2 or greater, no matter which hazard, signed off annually by our director. What does this equate to in the new system? And keep in mind, the new system, everything is flipped the other way as far as ratings, and they're not tied to NFPA. Is it based on the signal word, or would it be all SDSs with danger or warning need to be included in this log? What is your thinking?
Well, again, we need to look at what the NFPA means. The National Fire Protection Rating and how that rating is determined is completely different from the analysis of a chemical product and its safe use in the workplace. What I would say, my initial response would be that if the products that you are using in the workplace do continue to have the NFPA or HMIS rating still attached to it, And that is part of your HAZCOM program to keep a log of that information to continue to do so. However, should you find that the replacement safety data sheets by the same supplier no longer carry the NFPA rating, understand that they are not the same as the GHS hazard classification. And if this information is still required, I would encourage you to go back to the supplier to confirm that the NFPA rating still applies.
Yes, because I would say that sounds like it's a corporate specific specification for that log they're doing. That is not a mandatory OSHA or EPA log that's being created for that. So
Correct.
that would need to be internal discussions within that company. Okay, and our next question. Our audit would include the chemicals that are distributed along with the chemicals that we use, including cleaners and housekeeping materials. Is that correct?
The short answer to that is yes, because they are present in the workplace. So even if you're temporarily storing ammonia or cleaners, there would be a physical location where all of these products are stored. So I would include it, yes.
Right, and I always warn people that because it's used in the workplace, the cleaning force may be in there using it, and then your employees in the next shift may be exposed to it because it was used to clean a surface or an area that they're working in. They are potentially exposed to it.
Yes, and one thing that we do have to be careful of is the types of cleaning solutions that may be used that may result in something that we wouldn't want. I'm thinking ammonia and bleach. Yes. Off the top of my head.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, let's move along. We've got quite a few questions left. How often do I need to train and retrain my employees to the new HAZCOM standard?
Well, a short answer to that was the training should have happened by December 1st, 2013. What I would say is, according to your HAZCOM plan, it would take place in a couple of ways. Number one, the onboarding of new employees who would be potentially exposed to hazardous chemicals. And then secondly, whenever a new chemical comes in, ensure there's training on that product, as well as refresher training, whether that takes place, a few times a year or other times as dictated by the plan. It all depends on how many different types of hazardous materials come into your organization. That will help determine how often this type of training takes place.
And this next question, I'm not sure I quite understand what they've asked, but it says Section 9, must all properties be listed if they do not apply to the product? Not sure I understand that one.
In some cases, for either chemical mixtures or articles, some of the categories in there may not apply. To answer the question, each of the index fields must apply on a safety data sheet, but if the response to some of those areas, including Section 9, is not available or not applicable or no data is available, a response may be given even though there may not be a numeric value associated with that particular field. You just need to answer the question.
Okay, and our next question. As a manufacturing company, we receive and use raw materials and chemicals in the process. If we have inventory with old labels, do we need to contact suppliers and apply new labels to the existing inventories, or are we allowed to use them until we use them up?
You could use them, however, if there's a continual shipment. Any shipments that take place should have the new safety data sheet from the distributor or supplier, as well as labels or information so that you can create labels accordingly. Right now we're still in a transition period from an employer standpoint, but if that chemical is shipped to your organization on an active basis, you should expect to see, if not by now, expect to see very shortly an updated safety data sheet with label information in Section 2 that corresponds to the new OSHA HAZCOM 2012 standard.
I've got 3 more questions, so we're going to run a few minutes over, so let's try to get these 3 in. If a mixture is made in-house and never leaves the facility, does an SDS need to be created?
If there are people who are working with that chemical or with that mixture, and that mixture contains potentially hazardous ingredients, then it is highly recommended that a safety data sheet be authored for that product for safe use in the workplace by those people who are handling the materials.
Next question. On the label for a mixture, in addition to the product identifier, such as a foam blast 123, do you need to list the hazardous ingredients in the mixture as well?
On the GHS label, the GHS label elements in Section 2 should appear on the label themselves, not necessarily the hazardous ingredients in Section 3. However, labels that include, whether they're on state lists, for example, the safety and transport labels, if they include ingredients that show up on Prop 65 or New Jersey Right to Know, that type of industrial label should accompany the shipment if you're the manufacturer who's shipping it out. But as far as product labels go themselves, in addition to the identifier, GHS label elements in Section 2 must appear on that label.
Okay, and this next one is our last question that we'll get online. If there's anything else that comes in, we'll add it to the FAQ. Specifically pertaining to the shipping of non-refillable compressed gas cylinders, do the cylinders themselves, as well as the packaging, require the new pictograms and warning labels?
The DOT label would reflect the proper shipping for those products. As far as the canisters are concerned, because they're the ones that contain the product themselves, then the GHS label elements that apply to the product in that particular cylinder should be on the cylinder. We can certainly address that in a little bit more detail offline through the FAQ.
Absolutely. And if anybody else has any further questions, feel free to continue to email them to us or to funnel them through Dan Hilton at ASA. And I want to thank Louisa and SDSpro for having the webinar for us today. And again, thank you for attending today's webinar. In the near future, you will receive an email directing you to the replay and the accompanying documents. Also, watch your email for announcements about future webinars, and be sure to visit the ASA website at www.asa.net. Thank you and goodbye.